categorized into two general positions. One group that argues the name and imagery are simply a respectful means of expressing an appreciation for the Native Americans indigenous to our area. This can be seen throughout Centre County with references to Bald Eagle, Logan, all things Nittany, even the Nittany Lions. The other group argues that the name and imagery are simply a form of appropriation, and they are harmful stereotypes that continue to degrade and harm the very people they claim to appreciate. So our challenge here, as stated by one resident supporting change, is to listen, learn, and grow. We do need to grow in our understanding of both positions. We need to grow as individuals first, so we can understand and grow as board members, and then as a community and a district unified in our commitment to work collaboratively to achieve an acceptable outcome. Hopefully even a process and an outcome that serve as an example of civil discourse around a topic so seemingly divisive. To help us in that endeavor this evening, we have scheduled two presentations. Each presentation for up to 30 minutes, followed by an additional 30 minutes to answer questions from the board. Both presenters were encouraged to listen to the other if their schedules permit. And now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the evening, recently named as the Waterbury Chair in Equity Pedagogy at Penn State's College of Education. Her research focuses on ways educational settings promote achievement for marginalized youth. Prior to joining Penn State in July of this year, she served as the Ernest W. McFarland Distinguished Professor in Leadership for Education Policy and Reform, founder and director of the Education Policy Center, and Associate Dean of College of Education at the University of Arizona. Please welcome Dr. Francesca Lopez.
Thank you so much for that introduction and also the contextualization. I think it's very important. Education is all about learning, right? And it's a trajectory I think that we all have to be engaged with, myself included. And so I've prepared a presentation to share with everybody tonight. And let me get it ready to go. And I've entitled it, What is Cultural Appropriation and Why Should We Care? I do want to just note, I could have spent easily a couple of hours really talking about many of the things I'm going to cover. So it's just a beginning, and I'm eager to hear the questions and eager to come back if that's required or necessary. But I thought I would divide this presentation up into three components. One is just giving definitions, right? What is cultural appropriation and what's the definition? And then I want to talk about why it becomes problematic and what assimilation has to do with it. And then really getting at what we mean by honor and respect, because I think ultimately that's the goal, right? It's what people state that this is all about. So appropriation tends to be defined as the act of taking or using things from a culture that is not our own, especially without showing that we understand or respect this culture. According to Susan Scafati, a Fordham University law professor, this tends to be the most harmful when the source community is a minority group that has been oppressed or is exploited in other ways, or when the object of appropriation is something that's particularly sensitive, something like a sacred object for a community. But this key piece about showing that people understand or respect the culture, it's a subjective definition. And so it leads to a lot of contention. And I really believe we need to unpack that a little bit. So with cultural appropriation, very surface level, we tend to see that there is a group that is appropriating a culture, and people argue that expression, the use in the case here of mascots, for example, that it's stylish or it's an honor or a nod to a particular culture. Where it becomes problematic is that there tends to be a group from whom this particular thing is being taken from, who is punished in various contexts. So the first image that you see are dreads or cornrows, and we still to date see many areas or many spaces where Black students are banned from having natural hair or hairstyles that come from their particular culture, right? So it's just one very explicit example. And I want to talk a little bit more what I mean by banned or punished, because there is this explicit example here, right? That there's a dress code and that's contemporary and it's an issue. But there's a lot of other ways that are implicit that we really need to understand when we're talking about appropriation and when it becomes problematic. So here's another example, right, where school dress codes and grooming can be seen as the new whites only in some cases, where certain attire is required that doesn't reflect the culture of a particular student. And one of the issues that might seem superficial, and there are many reasons for dress codes, for example, but the core issue that threads across all of this is this notion of assimilation that I want to talk about, because it's a word we've all heard, but it means a lot more than the surface, like that you are becoming something that's part of the majority group. So what is assimilation? So cultural assimilation refers to this idea of replacing, and that is key, replacing cultural ways of being, language, religion, expression with, in our context, right, the American way. And in our context, we tend to see this in many ways, but I want to go back into history because this is important and it matters, and it's part of why we still see what we see today. There's a very long history in the US of assimilation, right? And it's typically fueled by these erroneous assumptions that, that people don't assimilate. So you can see here in this 1889 political cartoon that the element that won't assimilate, and those are the words used there, is the Irish, right? So we go back in history and there was the Irish. And depending on what snapshot we see in history, having people become part of the American way has always been a problem. And assimilation was one way to make sure that everybody was part of the thread of democracy in the United States, right? So Ralph Waldo Emerson used the melting pot. We've all heard the notion of the melting pot to describe this fusing process that transforms immigrants. And in this case, it was the English, the German, the Irish who immigrated into America, right? Into this individuality of the immigrant being gone. Traits of race and religion, they fuse down into this democratic alembic, like chips of brass thrown into the melting pot. So it becomes more about being an American, right, than wherever it was that our heritage is from. This particular phrase gained currency in 1908 when we saw another wave of immigration with Slavic, Jewish, and Italian immigration. So through these waves of immigration that we've seen, right, we tend to see this push for assimilation that becomes much more prevalent throughout our country. So this history of always fueling fear that certain groups would not assimilate is just a part of our DNA. And sometimes the notion of assimilation, right, has been viewed as that's the ideal. People should all be fused into this melting pot. And the notion that people can remain individuals tied to certain religions, ethnicities, and so on, while becoming part of the American fabric has been viewed as problematic, right? So here's a quote from an article that views this as problematic, saying that rather than assimilating, now different ethnic groups would coexist in separate identities like the ingredients in a salad, bound together only by the dressing of law and market. So this notion has always been infused in policies and practices, right, that promote assimilation, because we really, as far as our country, we really prefer, in terms of what we hear, is that the melting pot is the ideal. And we see this, right, through Native American boarding schools. There's a long history of this. English-only policies throughout the United States, and an assimilation-focused curriculum, decisions about what we include in our curriculum and what we exclude. And so this notion of assimilation totally ignores the very deep evidence we have that the second generation of immigrants tends to acculturate, such that they can navigate both that first generation family context and the majority context. So they can navigate both languages, practices, and so on. This is acculturation versus assimilation. And this is important because in research, whether I'm looking at psychology, sociology, anthropology, or health, I can add others, we understand that assimilation is actually quite negative. We see negative effects for physical health, for mental health, for academic outcomes, economic outcomes. There is no good that we see in research that really shows us that assimilation is a good thing. In contrast, and this is in relation to what I referred to as acculturation, maintaining of one's culture has the most positive outcomes, where people are taught to maintain their culture while they're also learning the other one. Now, the issue here is we don't usually see acculturation beyond the second generation. By the third generation, our immigrant populations, our English-only speakers, right, they have completely assimilated. And it's because our context is one that really forces this assimilation, despite the fact that we know that it has very serious negative outcomes, right? So if we consider this fact that our context emphasizes assimilation, that we know that the evidence on assimilation is quite negative in terms of various outcomes, there's this inherent tension when dominant groups adopt cultural practices and artifacts from marginalized communities, when these groups themselves who are marginalized have been prevented from maintaining cultural artifacts and practices, right? Therein lies this tension. And so there's this tension when we see dress codes in contemporary society and bans on certain hairstyles. But when the media itself is celebrating, right, for other populations, the ability to borrow this. So that's one of the tensions. Now, this notion of honor and respect that we hear is a very important one because it's intention, and that's important. And unfortunately, in this context, intention is not enough because there's a lot that still goes on incorrectly in our education system that requires a lot of additional learning for us to understand why this is not viewed as a notion of honor and respect, right? It is not viewed as appreciation because this requires that there's an understanding and the perspectives of those whom it represents, right? We can't just apply some honor and respect without talking to the communities from which we've borrowed, because that requires communication for there to be true honor and respect, right? So appropriation is this act of taking things without showing that we understand or respect. This requires discourse. This requires engagement. And it also requires understanding why certain things are viewed as a problem to begin with, right? And so I want to talk very briefly because we continue to see this throughout the United States, especially around this time, is many of us went through school, and these are the kind of images we saw in our K-12 schooling of cultural celebration. And in fact, I saw in one of the op-eds dealing with the very issue you all are discussing is this explicit mention of, I did not see Native communities when I grew up. That was by design. I'm going to mention that a little bit later. But we deal with these issues very superficially in our curriculum. And that then becomes an issue because then we see something like this, that in 2012, The Gap came out with this t-shirt. They came out with this as a design that was cool, taking and co-opting a term to mean conquering. So when we say we conquer our fears, we conquer, there is no negative connotation, but it is an ahistorical view of a term that to many communities is very traumatic, right? Because it refers to the genocide, the Trail of Tears that occurred in our history. And so we cannot view these issues of adopting certain terminology without acknowledging history. It is true, we are not living that history now, but those effects are still very much present in what we see in marginalized communities, right? So with looking at the Mascot issue more explicitly, Native American teen names mean honor and respect. I borrowed this from the NCAA when they were dealing with this very issue. We have to understand that history tells a very different story. It does not tell one of adopting these names as honor and respect. It came all about, and I won't give a history lesson here, I'm happy to come back, but when all these things started to infiltrate in our society, it happened during a time of Trail of Tears, boarding schools, and many other atrocities toward Native American communities. These were not individuals who were immigrants into the United States. They were already here, but assimilation was still a key component of what they experienced. And many of the cultural celebrations that were adopted in the Boy Scouts, in team names, were done at the same time as genocide, children being taken from their families, their heads being shaven, them not being allowed to practice their religion or speak their language. And I can go on and on and on. So when we look at our history about 1912, when the Boston Braves adopted their name, the Cleveland Indians, the 20s and 30s, where all these names started to be used, these years were not consistent with the notion of honor and respect. And that is what we need to really acknowledge when we're trying to see this debate, right? And what we really intend to do, if we intend to inflict harm or we intend to honor and respect a community, right? And we have to understand that during this time, there were civilization regulations that forbade Native Americans to speak language. their language, their religion, including ceremonial dances, while at the same time, painted up mascots could dance on the sidelines and mock ceremonial rituals, right? So these years before and after the naming of sports teams, we had the quote from Pratt, where we had the Carlisle School about an hour and a half from here, not that far from us, right, with these boarding schools, where the Indian, there is in the race should be dead, kill the Indian in him and save the man. This is the era, right, that they were in. Boarding schools, as I mentioned. So in 1928, we have this report finding, right, that children in boarding schools were malnourished, overworked, harshly punished, and poorly educated. These are very benign terms for very severe abuse lived by many Native American children who were in these boarding schools. And then more than many years later, right, through the Kennedy report, it was an acknowledgement. This is a national tragedy. So herein lies our context that has still informed many of the issues that we see to this very day, right? So history matters. We can't ignore it. Many of our communities are still living it. And I want to remind us that many of us don't see or live with these experiences on a daily basis. And this is by design. There was segregation, and many of us live in communities with people who are like us. And many of us don't have the opportunity to really engage with other races or ethnicities. And this is, again, by design, right? There's a reason for the hyper-segregation that since 1980 has only been getting worse and worse. So I want to use this quote that deals with this very issue. Why do people continue making a mockery of our culture? In almost every game of hockey, basketball, baseball, and football, whether in high school, college, or professional leagues, I see some form of degrading activity being conducted by non-Indians of Indian culture. We Indian people never look the way these caricatures portray us, nor have we ever made a mockery of white people. So why do they do this to us? It's painful to see the mockery of our ways. It is a deep pain. Now, I do want to end my presentation with the fact that you can do cultural appropriation right. I'm hoping that everybody can hear. If board members would just like nod so I know that you can hear it. I'll be able to hear it. I want to make sure I clicked on the right. Can you hear that?
This Amazonian child.
Can you hear it?
It started at first and now I can't hear it.
Okay. Oh. You can't hear it? I'm going to stop my share. Oh, let me see. Hold on. Okay, let's try this again.
Amazonian tribe inspired the latest high-end collection by the Brazilian sportswear brand Assimilation.
That's good.
Is it inspiring or is it exploitative? It is, in the strictest sense, cultural appropriation. The term has caught fire online as a way to shame creators who borrow from cultures other than their own, often in pretty insensitive, sometimes even racist ways. But borrowing in itself is not a bad thing.
Evaluating Oscar's work, there really is tremendous transformation. We can say, here we have an artist, not merely a cultural tourist or a collector.
Susan Scafidi literally wrote the book on cultural appropriation. She says that Aslan is showing a model of how it could be done right.
If I do a project, it must be something common, sharing values, sharing vision, sharing the economics, sharing things.
Metsavat is a UNESCO ambassador who's had a relationship with the Ashaninka tribe in the Amazon for years. He's helped build a school, befriended their shaman, and even designed a new logo for them. On his recent visit, he emerged with concepts for his 2016 spring fashion line. He didn't copy designs, but he was inspired by them.
That red of their tattoos, it's a beautiful red. Things that seduce me and make me in an emotional way, they create already an image in my mind.
At the business end, Aslan's new collection is structured the way many artist collaborations are. The tribe will receive royalties from sales of the clothes.
I think it was a great balanced work between us.
It's not fair to ask any culture to freeze itself in time and live as though they were a museum diorama. Culture is fluid, culture evolves, but it should go both ways with respect.
When cultural appropriation is done right, everyone can benefit. One of the Ashaninka leaders said that Osklund's collection helped share their environmental message with a much wider audience. In modern global society, we're often exposed to all kinds of cultures. That's something to celebrate. It's often the way great art happens. It would be a huge mistake to shut that out.
I was in the Amazon, I had that experience, a metaphysical experience and a cultural experience. Those things get embedded.
Chief Brown.
This is the magic of style. It's the magic of art. It's the magic of the design.
So just to wrap up, I think one of the key things I want to highlight in that clip everybody just saw is that it was this mutual beneficial exchange. In going with the tribes, they receive royalties for the art that they generate, right? It wasn't just taking from them and saying, we're honoring this culture. It was truly having communication and cross-cultural experiences to show understanding. And so I will end there.
Thank you very much. So we'll go around, I think probably to begin, instead of me calling on people that may not be ready, if anybody would like to begin with a question that they might have, please feel free to jump in there.
May I ask?
Sure.
Okay, Dr. Lopez, so our name specifically is the Red Raiders. Do you see a circumstance under which that could it ever be an example of honor or respect, or is that name just going to be appropriation or an insult?
It's not only appropriation, given our history, it is a very harmful and derogatory appropriation. In some venues, the name red, the very use of the color, denotes horrific practices against many Native American communities that refers to blood. And so there's very deep representation of that trauma that got changed along the way in history. And many of us never even knew that. I certainly did not know that growing up. I know many of us never, if we knew that that's what the term meant, I don't think many of us would be in favor of such a derogatory term. In this particular case, that is the issue with that particular terminology. And there's resources available that describe the history. I'm happy to provide them to all of you because it goes through some of those terms where the NCAA was really pushing many of these collegiate teams to get rid of that term in particular, because there were other Red Raiders teams that were at the college level, and they abandoned that and just changed it completely.
What about people who would say that it is not offensive, even Native American groups who might disagree and say it's honorable? How do you address it?
That's a really wonderful question, because that's
well, you have one person.
If I could just pause, I could break in here 1 second. Is that Chief Brown that called in?
Yes, I am. This is Chief Brown, and I am awestruck by that statement that was just made.
Well, let me ask you this.
And I tell you why when I get the chance, okay?
Listen. I need you to mute your microphone because this is your time is not to speak yet. So if you could please mute your microphone so that we can let the first speaker have her time, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, done.
Thank you very much.
So just to answer your question very quickly, that is a question that's asked many times with very often about cultural appropriation. If a particular representative of a group says it's okay, then maybe it's okay. But very often one member or a group of people do not represent an entire civilization or group. Very often with communities, it's about community support and community representation. If there is truly a community support and representation and a link to rationale, the issue here is that there is history as to why that particular term is problematic. And it would have to be debated with the particular community that is said to be represented, right? I am certainly not a representative of that community.
Thank you.
I was going to say, can you speak at all to maybe any of the psychosocial effects that might occur to folks that might identify with that culture, and then also maybe the education that might be imparted to the majority of students? Since we're in an educational community, what kinds of messages are we sending to both marginalized students and also students of the majority culture by continuing with this mascot nickname?
You know, it's very psychologically, and not only psychologically. I mean, we know these kinds of depictions lead to stereotypes. Those stereotypes lead to implicit bias, which leads to prejudiced behavior. And so there isn't ever, or well, sometimes there is, but typically you don't see people who are seeking out to be harmful or damaging or racist, right? It ends up being a microaggression, a statement said because of implicit bias that ends up being damaging. Through my own research, I mean, and many other people, not just my own, the issue is that our curricula does not teach truth. It does not teach an honest accounting of history. We end up having Black History Month, Hispanic History Month. Indigenous individuals are not even part of the curriculum. And so when people are not taught about this, and because we live in segregated spaces, it becomes an issue where we make assumptions and we base our decisions on stereotypes. For individuals, if we look at the academic, at the health, at the mental health and physical health, and other psychological outcomes like depression and suicide, there is a big difference between members of communities that are in the more dominant sense and marginalized communities that live in poverty or people of color, and those who do not live with those situations because of their race and socioeconomic background. And it just cuts through the fact that we definitely affect people's identity, and that identity propels individuals to build conceptualizations of what's possible. If all we teach about, for example, Black individuals is slavery, and have literature that depicts them as oppressed individuals, but never highlight the contributions and the positives, then we're sending very deficit-laden messages to those students. And we end up seeing that in the effects, right? We can look at any data point. Data speaks. We can look at disciplinary rates, dropout rates, achievement rates, matriculation to college rates, health outcome rates. And there are divides in terms of race, ethnicity, right? And socioeconomic status. So absolutely, it's bound to individuals' identities, but it is a call to action that I think everybody needs this education, because we find ourselves in this very situation, honestly, because we haven't had that education.
Thank you. Are there others?
Yeah, I've got a quick question. I hope it's a quick question. You've shown us one example of how it's been a positive approach to respecting Indigenous people. In your opinion, what do you think is the best way that we here as this school district and people of our community could show respect and appreciation for Indigenous people?
I think that requires conversations with communities representing Indigenous communities, right? I am an outsider to that. So I need to acknowledge the fact that it's something that needs to be done here in this location with the communities that can speak to what that would look like. It will look different here than it would where I was, where Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui were the tribes that were where our university had the lands. In the case of Penn State, for example, we occupy many, many Indigenous lands and benefited from many of them across the United States. So there are innumerable tribes that we should be having conversations with as a university. So it requires engagement. In the clip that I showed, I mean, there was mutual engagement and talk and understanding. It's often difficult, but to have that, there needs to be trust that is built, right? And so I think from my perspective, that is what needs to happen. A conversation needs to happen so that mutual understanding can be reached. And if the intent is to honor, then what does that look like to the community that you wish to honor, right?
Thank you. I think that's where my interest lies in, rather than making a decision to erase, for lack of a better term, all reference to Native Americans. How do we begin the process of really engaging or even finding people that would be descendants of indigenous peoples here or anything of that nature so that we can start that process? I know that the administrative team here has undertaken changes to our curriculum to bring some of this stuff into the education at our within our district. So it's a first step, but I even with that, I think until we start to engage in those communications with the right groups, even that curriculum is going to be tough to really pick up the elements of natives from this area that really need to be a part of that to have the discussion that we're having now. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Mr. Gazar, would you suggest we talk to natives in our community, our specific community?
I think that's part of the process, yes, and not just a keep it or get rid of it kind of a conversation, a real conversation about how they feel about different things and how we can be part of that community of where we respect each other's culture and respect each other as individuals, and just have an understanding of that whole process. I believe is what Dr. Lopez is sort of alluding to.
Right.
And I would agree.
We have, I'm sorry, Mrs. Bruckner.
That's okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we have had local people who are indigenous and we have their names. So we can reach out to those folks. People who are clearly native and said they were, and that's just, I just think that we do have those people and we do have some of their names.
I would agree with that. It's a place to start.
And I was going to say something similar is that, you know, I want to speak to representatives that are members of groups because there are a lot of people here who are like 1/100th of a % of Native American. And I don't think that has enough of the cultural appropriation, that point of view that we're looking for, is what I was going to say.
We have no recognized tribes in Pennsylvania, either federally or state. The last tribe that actually had some property in Pennsylvania was in the upper tier, and they were flooded out by a dam that came in the 70s, and they were moved up to the New York State. I believe they were Senecas. So if we're going to reach out to tribes or nations, I think that would be the start, because we have to identify people who are, you know, if for better use of the term, legitimate members of that tribe, just like they've done in other locations of the country.
I mean, that is typically the process. The one I'm familiar with really requires engaging with tribal leaders, right? They are the ones who speak on behalf of the communities that are represented, and it's usually a long road in discussing, trying to get mutual understanding, right? To ensure that it isn't exploiting. But I think that's a wonderful suggestion.
So what we're talking about is trying to identify so that we can engage with tribal leaders that are, obviously there are none in PA, but at least that were in or from maybe the region is the better way to say that instead of locally, if that would be prohibitive as far as, or non-productive. Are there any other questions for Dr. Lopez?
I think you kind of touched on this before, but the messages that students, our non-native students or our community what are the ongoing effects of that? I mean, in the implicit bias, is that further kind of entrench, carrying this on further, entrench that or dehumanize a group of people? How does that all kind of come together?
You refer to it exactly. I mean, when individuals who go to school and they don't see representation, whether it's Indigenous representation, Black representation, Latino representation, and all they have are, notions from very stereotype. And honestly, if we're relying on movies and the media and, shows that typically create caricatures of individuals, right? And that's the only thing we have to absorb throughout our lifetime. That is all we have in terms of our conception of individuals. And the brain absorbs this information whether we're aware of it or not, right? And it's one of the reasons that we tend to see, so I'll just share this very briefly. In my own research, I found that in a community that was predominantly Latinx, right? When the curriculum infused the students' lived histories into the curriculum, right? Which is not our typical curriculum, but actually demonstrated and put it into every single subject matter. They had higher levels of their own identity. They wanted to learn more about other people's identities. They had lower perceptions of perceived discrimination. So very important, because those three things together, in addition to academic identity, right? Their academic identity was higher and their math and reading outcomes were higher. So this holds true whether it's looking at elementary school, middle school, high school. Those students end up going to college at higher rates. They do better academically and in their lifetime. It's a very nefarious trajectory for students to only see negative depictions of themselves. For students, the ones you're asking about, who don't see those depictions, they're being cheated of a full understanding, which is why I believe, right, we see what we saw with the t-shirt that I gave as an example about using that term as though it doesn't have meaning, why we continue to have this debate about using a mascot. Because when we all are taught about the accurate history and see representation and understand people in deep ways, and also understand the policies that marginalize certain communities, right? These are specific policies that were on purpose. It wasn't by accident. There was genocide. That is one of the biggest reasons, right? Trail of Tears, why many of us didn't go to school with Native communities. In the case of Arizona, where I was, there was not only boarding schools, but tribal lands that are then sovereign, right? So there are many reasons we don't go to school and learn about people like us. And if the curriculum isn't exposing us to it, all we're relying on are stereotypes and those implicit things. I've never seen implicit biases that deal with human beings play out in positive ways, because even for Asian communities, the stereotype that they're great at math and science leads to very damaging effects. I mean, there's quite a bit about this that I'm happy to, anyone can get in touch with me. So if you have questions, I'm happy to follow up with that.
Yeah, I think that's great, because I one of the things that I'm anxious to learn about is even just the cultural proficiency by which our students leave our district. Because I've heard stories of students leaving our district, having had all like 12 years of, wearing their, the imagery of the Indian on their sweatshirts and all, and leaving our area, going to other areas in the country, and then finding out there that it's not accepted in other places, and being surprised and being somewhat feeling cheated in their education with that.
That's exactly right.
If there are other ways that we can infuse that education, I mean, our high school starts every morning with a war chant before the morning announcements. And so I'm, again, thinking about how these messages resonate or what they carry on for our students and our community beyond, and for the future of our community and where our students go and the representation that they are of our area.
So it's not only the students of your district, right? We see it with stars who who wear headdresses that are meant for ceremonies and are sacred, and they're being misappropriated, right? It's a disservice not to prepare students for a global reality. If we want students to go to higher education, to have, all the opportunities that we say education provides, we need to be able to provide students an opportunity to be culturally proficient in multicultural settings, right? Rather than confront that the moment they come in. And this is why we see in higher education contexts issues with Halloween, with cultural appropriation. I can go on and on. These problems would be eliminated if our curriculum in K-12 would address them head on.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that right there.
Thank you. Other questions? Dr. Lopez, one of the things that someone had mentioned to me was, and you had mentioned, you can appropriate in proper ways. I wonder what your thoughts are on, say, organizations that celebrate Native Americans, like the Boy Scouts, for example, and how their traditions can be viewed either as acceptable appropriation or is that viewed differently? Do you have any opinion on that?
What I have is not necessarily an opinion. It's what I've read. And it's, again, part of this NCAA documentation that details the history and why the NCAA took the position to really push institutions to move away from that. And in that document, it provided a historical account that I think is very important. I will share it with you because I think it's worth reading for everybody to understand. And I'll be honest with you, the first time I read it, it was news to me. I did not understand, where these ideas came from and when they were celebrated. And so the image that I showed in my presentation about the pageantry, at the same time that pageantry was happening, and at the same time that atrocities were occurring with many indigenous communities in the US, the Boy Scouts were co-opting many of these indigenous practices. Now, we're never taught that, right? And so you start to have this bifurcation in our history where indigenous communities are banned from their cultural practices, their language, being able to access their, the very thing that makes us who we are, right? Language, we know, psychologically, religion, the culture we grow up as makes us who we are. And when you are cut off of that, and at that same time in history, to have all these organizations, first the pageantry, and the Boy Scouts, if we look to where that co-opting of indigenous practices started to occur, and I just want to be clear, there are many, many tribes across the United States, many, right? And it became a pan-ethnic group, much like Irish, Italian, right? This pan-ethnicity happens when groups start to become a whole. And even though there were many differences among different tribes, and so the practices that the Boy Scouts adopted, they were not celebrating a particular practice by a particular tribe. It became this amalgam of many things, right, that they adopted. And it too, according to much documentation, is viewed as very problematic. But it was woven in our society to be celebrated, right? And when something is woven into our society where it is celebrated, and we are not taught the actual history of where it comes from, and we are not taught the atrocities that happened to an entire community and sets of communities, right, from which that was borrowed, then if we take an ahistorical view, we scratch our heads wondering why we're receiving so much backlash for this particular practice. It's very much like what we were just discussing about students who aren't taught and they get to college and are confronted with it the very first time. There is an actual history as to that bifurcation when some of those practices were co-opted, right? So it's not necessarily my opinion. It's not my opinion to make. But if I'm reading the history and that's where those practices became adopted by the Boy Scouts and other organizations, that is a problem because of the very history and context from which those practices came to be.
Thank you. Other questions or discussion? Well, hearing none, Dr. Lopez, I'd really like to thank you for your time this evening. I'd encourage you to stick around for the next presentation, and anything that you can get to the board, our group, any member, I think would help us in our path forward. What seems like maybe an easy task or a simple vote, there's a lot that needs to go into it, and I think we're going to need all the help we can get trying to navigate that process. So thank you again very much. All right. See, it's about 6 o'clock here, so let me check the participant list and see if who we need is here. I believe so. So with that, again, thank you to Dr. Lopez, and I'd like to now welcome our next speaker for the evening, who's an award-winning research student of Stanford psychologist, Dr. Phil Zimbardo. His journal published on such topics as communications, inoculation, national identity, and race. He's considered an expert on the history and traditions of the Redskin warriors by the state of Pennsylvania. His research on Redskins and Red Men provided core arguments in the successful federal court amicus Redskins brief in helping to protect Native culture based on the philosophy of educate, not eradicate. He, like many Americans, is part Native American and seeks to maintain the rich cultural history and traditions of Native America, especially within our public schools, teaching and sharing the quickly disappearing history of the continent's first people. He is joined this evening by his mentor, who grew up steeped in the traditions of the Cheroanhaka Indian tribe. His education began in a one-room country schoolhouse, a set-aside for people of color. Later, while a senior at Norfolk State University, he was drafted into the U.S. Army. He is a graduate of the Armed Forces Staff College, U.S. Army's Race Relations Leader courses, and more. He is also the elected chief of the Cheroanhaka Indian tribe. Please welcome Mr. Andre Billeaudeaux and his mentor, Chief Walter D. Red Hawk Brown. Mr. Billeaudeaux, are you with us this evening?
Yes, hello board, good evening. Andre Billeaudeaux, I'm speaking to you from Washington State, just outside the Mascot Indian Reservation on the very northwest tip of the continental United States. Hello.
Hello.
Chief Brown, are you there?
This is Chief Brown, I'm here. And I'm a native tongue to say OCO.
Thank you, gentlemen. The floor is yours. You can proceed as you wish then for your presentation.
Just for clarity, how much time is Chief and I allotted? Are we open to give this presentation?
We ask that you up to 30 minutes for your presentation. And then if you could stick around for about a 30-minute question and answer period, that would be greatly appreciated.
Okay. Chief, the floor is yours if you'd like to open.
Hey, thank you, Andre, and good afternoon. And I would, Iroquois native language, we say Osio Vaquatasanta Iniha Anikiying. Hello and good afternoon, men and women. We're very fortunate, first of all, and I say this because we're talking about Pennsylvania, is that our tribal language is actually on file at the Philadelphia Institute of Religion in Pennsylvania. It was recorded originally by a former professor of mathematics at William and Mary College on March the 4th, 1820, and the vocabulary was taken by John Wood, a former professor of mathematics at William and Mary, And the vocabulary was taken from my fifth foster great grandmother, Edith Turner, whose name was Wani Runtara. Thomas Jefferson procured that language in August of 1820, and he sent it to Peter de Pontier, who was a student of Indian languages in Philadelphia. And the letter of which we have 3 letters of interchange between Peter de Pontier and Thomas Jefferson, wherein Jefferson told Peter de Pontier, I've come across this ancient Powhatan language. But luckily for us, Peter de Pontier wrote back to Thomas Jefferson and said, I am sorry, sir, but this language has an Iroquois dialect. It is the same dialect as the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Tuscarora, the Seneca. And were it not for that, the Algonquin speakers here in Virginia would have been claiming our language. So Philadelphia has a great archive for my people, the Chero-and-Hawk Indian tribe here in Southampton County, Virginia, and we are Iroquois speakers. I want to lead in with that so you know that you have some history there, okay, pertaining to Iroquois people. And also the Susquehannock tribe that came out of that area. Some of my learned colleagues would say they were Algonquin, but we believe that they were Iroquois. They came out of what is now Pennsylvania also. Let me say this. I was listening to some of the comments that Dr. Lopez made in reference to the NCAA and in reference to blood quantum, etc. And I would like to talk about that a few minutes, okay? First of all, I'm going to talk about the NCAA, which is strongly backed by the Capitalistic Society of the Almighty Dollar, okay? My daughter attended Women Mary College in Williamsburg. Women Mary College was the first school that was set aside here in Virginia to teach Indigenous Americans English, Christianity, and mathematics. That school was known as the Brafferton. That was when Provisional Lieutenant Governor Alexander Spotswood was the governor of Virginia. This was still under the English control, okay? So the Brafferton was established to teach Indigenous people math, English, and Christianity in 1711. The school stands there now. There's a big marker for it. However, the NCAA got involved in that, and they had, with all the pressure they provided on Women Mary, they had their 2 feathers removed from the tribe. The reason is, the problem is that we are eradicating out all Native American history in the Annuals of Colonial History that was written by the colonials, okay? I mean, 99% were written by the colonials. Probably less than 1% was written by Indigenous American people. As you say, Native people, I say First Americans, American Indians. And that's one of the issues we got. We need to start educating. Had it been that people understood that Women Mary College, the Brafferton, was the first school set aside to teach Indigenous Americans, they would not have pushed so hard to remove the 2 feathers. That's part of my culture, part of my traditions, part of my history, and most importantly, part of my self-esteem. And that's what's happening. We're trying to take away everything pertaining to Native Americans, and what we're doing, we are destroying and negating out the self-esteem of a lot of First Americans that are living on reservations. And I'm quite sure that my friend Andre is going to talk about the Redskins, okay? But they negated that out. And some of the psychological effects that happened on the reservations after the Redskin name went away, as a counter to Dr. Lopez's comments, okay? As she talked about the philosophical and the self-esteem that is being caused by using mascots, etc. So I say that to say that we have a very rich history, and it has to be recorded in the Annuals of Colonial History. As an example, I have been working with the Department of Education here in Virginia since 2002, because when I was going to a one-room school where I walked 2.5 miles to and fro to get an education in a one-room school from the 1st grade to the 6th grade, all we knew about was Pocahontas and Powhatan. Nothing about the 3 linguistic groups in Virginia, which are Algonquin, Iroquois, and Siouan. There's only one Siouan tribe here in Virginia now, because the other 2, the Occaneecha and the Saponia in North Carolina, of course, the Monacan tribe now is they're federal recognized. So there was nothing that was taught in the Annuals of Colonial History, and I keep using that for a term, Annuals of Colonial History, because everything is promulgated, reference what they wrote, and they wrote to the color of their own persuasiveness. The same as people do today, okay? They read a document and they want to analyze it and write it. They write it to the color of their own persuasiveness, and this is what the problem is. First Americans need to start writing their own history. Whatever you're doing in reference to the Red Raiders, from my perspective, it is an honorable name. It reflects honorably on First Americans. As the chief of the Cherokee Nottoway Indian tribe, as a retired lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, one war too many, growing up on a farm, wearing bib overalls with patches on my breeches, walking around barefoot, okay? I am strongly in favor of the things that are being done to keep First Americans' history alive. This eradication is going to have to cease. It's going to have to stop. Otherwise, eventually, there's not going to be anything that talks to all of the achievements, that talks to all the tribes in the United States as it applies to First Americans. That's an example. There were some 40-some tribes here in Virginia. In 1988, when Governor Billeaudeaux was the governor of Virginia, 3 professors at Radford University in Radford, Virginia, put together an outline map of the Commonwealth, and they identified where all the tribes were in Virginia, and it was included in the Virginia Atlas in 1988 to include showing the warriors' trails, because the majority of all the roads and stuff that we use, the highways and byways, were originally Indigenous American trading paths. As an example, the Warriors Trail, which is now Highway 81, that runs from the western quarter of Virginia to Washington, D.C., that was originally a Native American trading path, and was called the Warriors Trail. So we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful with what people are writing and what they are interpreting. We have to be very careful when people make statements that is going to cause psychological problems on First Americans, on Indigenous Americans, if we don't do this and if we don't do that. Self-esteem. These things that we are doing as far as establishing Native American icons is bringing about self-esteem for Indigenous Americans. It's bringing about self-esteem for my people. And I'll give you another example, okay? Let's talk for a minute about the Iroquois Treaty of Peace. The colonials have not included that from a holistic aspect in the education of our people, okay? As an example, the Iroquois Treaty of Peace, 1147, is the oldest democracy in the United States. When it was turned into English, originally it was done on wampum belts and it was spoken. Then later on, it was turned over into English with 117 articles, okay? Benjamin Franklin and the other founders of the Constitution used the Iroquois Treaty of Peace, those articles, as the framework for the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. But you won't see that in the history book. You will not see that the Senate, the U.S. Senate in 1988 enacted a resolution 343 honoring that and attesting to the Iroquois Treaty of Peace as being used as the framework for the United States Constitution, to include the 7 errors, okay, which is hard to break. You can break 1 error a lot easier you can do 7, okay? So those things need to be incorporated into our educational system. And I'll give you another example. And of course, Andre and I had talked about that once before, and I think we had a conference call with the Director of Interior, I believe, in reference to citizenship tests that are given to immigrants that come here when they want to become a citizen of the United States. You will not find not one question pertaining to First Americans in this country. And we have been here since the beginning of time. And people are still saying that Columbus discovered America. Columbus never set foot on U.S. soil. He came into San Salvador and he started the first transatlantic slave trade and brought all these diseases over. We have been here since 700 AD based on an archaeological dig, and I'm a life member of the Archaeological Society of Virginia, based on an archaeological dig that was done in 1965, 66, and 69, that Dr. Gerald Smith, PhD, Dr. Gerald Smith, was involved in that dig. There were artifacts that they found that dated back, carbon dated back to 700 AD for my people here in Virginia. So we're still teaching that Columbus discovered America in 1492. I mean, like Russell Means said, one of the renowned actors and an activist, Native American activist, he said, it's time for Columbus to die. That needs to be taken out of the annals of colonial history, because what we are doing, and I'm going to state it emphatically, we are teaching our young people a lie. So we have to be careful that we do not eradicate out First American history, because if we do that, we take away from the self-esteem of our young Indigenous Americans. Now you got drug problems, you got suicide, and everything else, because there's no self-esteem. So, I mean, I'm adamant and I'm very passionate about that because we need to make sure that we are educating our young people about the true history of Native people throughout the United States. And in reference to eradicating out icons and stuff, I am totally against that. It's like I was against the 2 feathers being removed from Women Mary College as being part of the tribe because our first Native American school was there. And it was the Oneida tribe in Canada that pushed for that. I mean, some of these tribes they bring in billions of dollars in gambling casinos, okay? The Oneida tribe is one of them, of which they gave $10 million to the opening of the National Museum of American Indians, and so did the Mascot Pequot tribe in Connecticut, okay? So it appears that it is the capitalistic dollar that's pushing all these changes. Eventually, we're not going to have anything in our educational system about American Indians or indigenous Americans, First Americans, etc. So we have to be careful. We have to make sure that we educate and not eradicate. But anyway, I would recommend that. I would make one recommendation that you guys go to the Philadelphia Institute of Religion. You can go online and check out our Iroquois language. That's a part of your great state. Okay, and thank you.
Thanks,
for allowing me to give my comments.
Anyway, good afternoon. This is Andre Billeaudeaux, and I want to thank Dr. Lopez for being on board the call today. I was able to listen to most of her presentation and take some notes. With so little time, I want to preface what I have to say by saying there is no way in 20 or 30 minutes that Chief Red Hawk and myself and the groups and thousands of people that we represent can make an adequate case here in front of you. It took us 2 years of testimony, deep dives into research, to make the case in Pennsylvania that a high school can reasonably keep its Redskin names and tradition. That case was made with a state hearing officer and lawyers representing the state and the opposition, which was well funded. I make up a group of volunteers, Chief Red Hawk included. We are not paid professionals. We are part of a 501c3 that operates on donations and volunteer time. My interest in this runs deep. I am part Native American, and my whole life I've been in and around Native American communities, from the Eskimos and Aleuts of the Arctic, from where I spent 5 working seasons, all the way down to the southern tropics, the islands in and around Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, on my way to and from Antarctica, where I spent 3 years. One of my passions has been promoting and identifying Native cultures, traditions, icons, language. And this is what I'm doing today on my own time. I stand in the same woods that I share with the Makah Reservation just west of me. And I'll have it known that they are proudly known as the Makah Red Devils. I'll also note that Dr. Lopez, when confronted with the term red, signaled that it's a reference to blood. And in that, I will agree. It's also very spiritual notation in that there is a very strong religion, passion, connectivity with the Great Spirit through either blood or representation of blood, for which the basis of your Red Raiders is known and made. Red Raiders was a very strong and popular name in historical context, up in and around where the Delaware, Lenape, and even the Comanche in the south central part of the United States made their presence known. It is a factually based name. One of the greatest raids ever conducted in America was done in Texas, in Victoria, Texas, in the 1800s, 1840s, I believe, as well as up into Vermont, New Hampshire by the Abenaki tribe, oftentimes with the Delaware as well, to earn the saluted name Red Raiders, which ultimately the United States military special forces has galvanized around both the methodological ways of survival in the woods, scouting, raiding, and there's a long tradition of the United States military not appropriating, but assimilating with ultimately their native allies and friends. And I will tell the board right now that the assimilation of Europeans into indigenous culture in North America was very strong. Chief alluded to the Great Law of Peace, and one of the bylaws within that Great Law, one of the standards, and it works to the United States citizenship process that you'll see, is that the Great Law is accepting of other tribes and races to come know the Great Law and then sit under the protection of Carrion-Dewanda, the great tree, which is symbolic of the Great Law. So important was this transition of identity, shared identity, and the gift of Native identity to the Continental Congress, that when the Iroquoian leaders visited the Continental Congress in 1776, they bequeathed the name Great Tree, or Carrion-Dewand, to the president of the Continental Congress. And that's an identity shared, and it represents the U.S. Constitution today. The U.S. Constitution takes in people from all over the world under the same precepts and concepts provided by the Great Law. That if you follow and learn the bylaws of the Constitution, or in essence, the bylaws of the Great Law of Peace, you are accepted into this nation. That is how open the Great Law is to assimilation into it. We are, whether we believe it or not, a hybrid Native nation based on those concepts and precepts. This also includes that more than half of your students there in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, most likely have Native DNA. More than half of all Americans carry measurable Native DNA. I think that is an important concept, and it rolls into educate, not eradicate. Let me roll back a minute to talk about what Dr. Lopez noted with reference to some of the key research that I'm sure she's included in her presentation. The APA, American Psychological Association, 2005 overture about the use of mascots, which is a misnomer in this case for sure. I'm going to ask you, school board, do you actually have an actor or an actress on the sidelines at your sporting events dressed as a Native? Is that still a tradition there, or is that a bygone issue?
That is gone from the past. There used to be.
Okay, and so emphatically, and this is something that we had to work out in the state of Pennsylvania, you do not have a mascot anymore. You have a symbol. There's no more mascotry going on. You have an identity. That is an important notion. It's a biased and politically loaded term. And I can get to why that is if I had more time, but just trust me, it's best if you want to have a fair discussion to call it your current symbol, that the Red Raider is your current symbol. Now, the APA study that's cited over and over again is a Stephanie Freiberg 2005 study, which claims through her human research experiments done in Arizona on reservations, that based on her responses from these students, that she was able to generalize out a series of beliefs that mascots specifically are damaging to Native American youth. Anybody who's gotten into that study and looked at the methodology, and this is part of the unraveling of the case made in Pennsylvania, can see that the reliability, validity, and generalizability is highly suspect. And I think the issue that resonates the strongest with academics is that these children, these teenagers, they weren't part of a human research standard approach. They were also fed statements before they were surveyed, to the extent that Americans think about Natives as if it was Chief Wahoo, as if their primary thought process shifts to Chief Wahoo, and that they're stereotypical, that non-Natives who live off the reservation thus are racist. that these strong words were fed to these experimented on teenagers before the data was gathered. That renders this study highly questionable, so much so that you'll note 3 years later in 2008, Stephanie Freiberg this time was joined by 3 other PhDs, and a lot of the same experimentation was attempted, but in a much different way, in a methodologically sound way. And the outcome was very, very different, to include findings that Native American icons, no matter the race, were the most inspiring kind of human imagery, human icons or symbols that could be ever promoted at a school. But also, most importantly, in the closing paragraph of that study, and I would hope you're very familiar with it by now, Freiberg et al. Support the notion that schools such as Bellefonte Red Raiders absolutely can keep their icon, their identity, if they simply broaden the base of what Native Americans are today, the potential of any Native American today in modern America, more history, more traditions, a broader base of understanding. And that, board, is a win-win solution. Something along those lines, broadening the base of understanding, education, language, making your school a center of excellence for Native American information, culture, tradition, allows you to keep not a mascot, but an authentic symbol of what was, which was a way of life, warrior ethos, which are still alive today in the U.S. Special Forces. The U.S. Rangers are based on patterns of survivability, ranging, martial knowledge, not based on European standards, but Native standards. On top of that, we have our Constitution, which is a hybrid Native way of thinking, a hybrid Native set of laws. You have more than 50% of your students carrying Native DNA. And somebody earlier mentioned that a percentage of blood quantum, quote, might not be enough. That harkens back, may I say, to the one-drop standard of the Old South. And while Natives on reservations are truly part of a Native nation, any Native that visits your school and gives a presentation off the reservation has U.S. citizenship. Now, those might be divergent concepts to some, but as a U.S. citizen and part of the Constitution, e pluribus unum is very specific. From many, we are one. We have that on our money, on our coinage, for a reason. These are the gifts of our forefathers. The same forefathers that used to celebrate St. Tammany Day. Who is St. Tammany? Who is Chief Tammany? Well, he's the first North American patron saint. And George Washington, who knew of the Great Law, who knew of the wonderful ways of Native America, started this national holiday on May 1st, and it lasted for generations. So back to Dr. Lopez's point, your children, our children, America's children of all kinds should know that there is a Native American Heritage Month that we're in the middle of. They should know who Chief Tammany is. They should know about America's founding fathers who are Native. Exclusivity is what we are against. We're about a win-win solution here and incorporating the elements of education that Chief Red Hawk touched on, that Dr. Lopez touched on. Where we disagree is that the maintenance of an identity can be had in today's political climate. I could go on for over an hour to tell you about the politicization behind the research and the movement to eradicate imagery such as what you highlight at your school around the country and the damage it's done to small towns. I can document that during my time as a startup think tank entrepreneur for the U.S. government in Monterey, I was part of a steering group. We studied school shootings over the last 40 years. Why, how, when, what was the motivation, what day of the week, what kind of weapon. and the ups and downs of national school shooting data. With these methods in mind, I went ahead and took a look at the CDC data amongst the nearly 600 tribes that register and file information with CDC in both the homicide and suicide composite. Using the same method, I was able to track homicide and suicides amongst Native American reservations over the last 40 years or so. And what I found, and these are numbers speaking, is while it was relatively high compared to non-reservation populations, both men and women on reservations, the measure of homicide, suicide dipped in concert with and every time that the NFL Redskins won a Super Bowl. It also dipped in concert with every time the Redskins won an NFC championship. When it didn't dip, the one time it did not dip was within a year after the media and President Barack Obama suggested that Redskins was not worthy of being identified with the NFL, that it was a racist name, that it should not be part of the American culture. Suicides and homicides since that year measure has gone up and up and up. It was at its lowest in the 1980s, and it spiked after 2015, and it continues to rise today. Meanwhile, in 2019, there was a national study done by the Washington Post around the country. They provided over 40 adjectives to Native Americans to describe how they felt about the term Redskins. And even with years of toxic media coverage and insistence that Natives hate this name, they had a supermajority select pride as their choice descriptor of the word Redskins. Now, if you correlate the findings of dips in homicide, suicides on reservations with national pride, when a president comes out and says, today we are all Redskins, hail to the Redskins, when the Redskins Chief Two Guns White Calf, an actual Native of the Blackfoot tribe, featured on the side of the helmet, is put in front of America and hailed, there's a sense of pride that comes from that, both Native and non-Native. So
do not turn your tabs on.
I suppose we're at the end of our 30 minutes, but let me say this. This deserves a lot more than what Chief and I can give you in just a few minutes. Your decision to change this name, this icon, your identity, will have significant impact on your community, the identity of your children, the academic standing of your school. It's often said that Natives do not do well. One of the last times we actually took a firm look at this narrative was in Maine, and Skowhegan Indians, their highest performing group, were Natives before they changed their name under duress just last year. I can say all of these narratives were tested during a hearing to include depositions. The state spent a lot of money and a lot of time getting to the bottom of this, but our band of volunteers who represent the vast majority of Natives are willing to stand up to these narratives, take a microscope to what's being claimed, and not be forced to change the names of these schools. Like I said, I can go on, and I think that this conversation should continue. But at this point, I will open up back to Chief if he wants to close out our conversation. Thank you.
Chief Brown, are you still with us?
Chief, are you there?
Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Oh, okay. I want to thank Andre for that outstanding presentation that he gave as it applies to a lot of historical data. But again, I just want to caveat on a few more things before I close out, and thanking everybody. Let's use the term Blackfeet Indians, okay? There's a Blackfoot Indian tribe. But people don't realize the way they got their name from colonialism, because whenever they went to war, they painted their legs from their knees all the way down black. People don't realize that the Iroquois people always used this red root to paint their bodies red whenever they went hunting or whenever they went to war. Okay, so red, as Dr. Lopez and as Andre said, yes, it could represent blood, but it also represents culture and traditions. And just like language, if you lose your language, if you lose your native language, you lose your culture. If you lose your culture, you lose your traditions. That's one of the reasons why we're here in Virginia. We're working on a spoken language CD based upon the vocabulary that former professor of mathematics at William & Mary, John Wood, recorded in 1820. And we're going to patent that with the school districts here. Since 2002, I have probably spoken to more than 500,000 students throughout the state of Virginia and other organizations, to include on the Hill in Washington, D.C., and also in Richmond, pertaining to the history of indigenous Americans. That it needs to be a hardcore surge to make sure our educational system is capturing the true history of Native people. And that's something that we have to make sure that we get involved in, and we have to push that. And in reference to Native people and the icons, we don't want to take away self-esteem for our indigenous young men and young women, okay? And that's what's going to happen. Because we have to have something that we can zero in on that's powerful, that reflects on our culture and our traditions. And as Andre said, I don't believe this conversation should stop here. It should continue to go. And you guys need to hold on to the Red Raiders. You need to hold on to that, okay? Because it's an honorable name, and it reflects positively on the indigenous American community. And again, I want to thank you for this opportunity to add my comments. And it's a pleasure to be a member of NAGRA, Native American Guardians Association, because we're pushing to educate, not eradicate, okay? Because there's so much history retaining to First Americans that's been eradicated out of our history books. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Brown and Mr. Billeaudeaux. I appreciate your input. And with that, we'll open up to board members that may have questions.
I'll go for it. I first off, thanks, Mr. Billeaudeaux and Chief Red Hawk, for being here and sharing the information. I do want to correct one thing. I know earlier we talked about not having a mascot per se, but I've been to many football games in recent years where members of our Raider Nation, our student body, have gone out onto the field in headdress and regalia. So while they may not be a mascot, there is still that representation that persists among our student body. So I just wanted to kind of correct that. I think that one of the things I wanted to say was that I don't think anyone on this board is talking about changing, about eradicating First American history from our curriculum. In fact, what we're talking about is, our last board meeting, we talked about some new curriculum that will be in to talk about history of marginalized people in this country. We also have a Native American course that all students will take during their time, as well as other reviews of curriculum. So that's definitely something that is of interest and is of a priority for us. But one of the things that I see somewhat of a disconnect with, and I'd like to kind of have a better idea on, is how can we accurately portray First American history while maintaining a symbol or a mascot that inaccurately represents history in our area? And so I guess that's a question that I'd like to, I think that when we think about a Raider, first off, our first Americans were not Raiders in this area. There probably were other individuals that could be seen as a Raider in the area. And not only that, our symbolism that we have is inaccurate for the first Americans that might have been in this area.
Yeah, hi, I'm not sure who you are, ma'am.
My name is Julie Fitzgerald. I'm a board member for the Bellefonte Area School District.
Yeah, hi, Julie.
I got a comment on that too, Andre.
Yeah, sure. You want to go first? Go for it.
Yeah, let me have a comment on that. As an example, let's suppose I go to football games and I got a top hat on. Okay. Suppose I go to a football game and I have the American flag on my T-shirt. Suppose I go to a football game and I have a beaver hat on with a long tail hanging down, and tell people, well, I'm just paying honor to the Davy Crockett and the Alamo. Okay. So a headband, from my perspective, if your students decide to go to a football game with a headband on, from my perspective, that's giving honor to Indigenous Americans here in America who were first. Okay. It's not racist. It's not racist. It's not derogatory. It's just they're paying tribute. The same way we pay tribute now to any other thing pertaining to American culture and traditions. That's the way I see that. Now, there are 11 state-recognized tribes in Virginia. Each tribe has a website. The 11 state-recognized tribes are one of 40 tribes that were here when the colonials came here, okay? And all of those tribes' websites address the history of their people. So this is a good source of documentation, whereas you can include educational information into your educational curriculum. You can have different people that come in your classroom and speak, preferably Indigenous Americans that can talk about the history of their people or their tribe. So the headband, from my perspective, and I say that boldly, does not represent something that's derogatory of presidents. It is paying honor or tribute. Okay, that's the way I look at that, Andre, and board members. Yep. And I'm glad that question.
Hi, Julie. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Chief. I think there's a couple layers to this response, Julie. You cite that there was no raiderism going on, and what part of Pennsylvania? You're northwest Pennsylvania?
We're central PA. Well, my point was is that I don't believe that the indigenous people were the raiders, is what my point was.
Okay. I would offer to provide you with data and details and testimony to counter that, but let me give you something of an answer that I think will work. What we've done, nagaeducation.org, is we typically can help a school go through and desensitize and culturally align with the proximity argument, by which you make with the Upper East Coast standards of what a Red Raider would look like. We've done that before with Native artists, world-class Native artists ready to go to help out, to do the research, to provide guidance. Secondly, in promoting Native American Appreciation Month, I've had the honor of working with the Kansas City Chiefs, for instance, and bringing out to the field more than 20 tribes to demonstrate cultural pride. And Julie, I think what the Kansas City Chiefs do well is they've gotten rid of the whole mascot confusion altogether. They are the Chiefs, however, on the sideline, they actually have a gray wolf. Now, these are not mutually exclusive opportunities. You can be the Red Raiders and provide your students with an icon that they can call a mascot as well. This is one path to success. The other one, of course, is to render your Red Raider into a more historically appropriate rendition by a Native artist. And then within your offerings of what you talked about, more specific history to give context to the term Red Raider and all the contextual benefits that we've talked about tonight. We've barely touched on it. I think you could find a path forward that would be a win-win to include your concern. I'll take the opposite. Sorry, Chief. I just don't think people who haven't earned a head nod to wear a war bonnet, and again, with all deference to Chief, I think that's something that I would disagree on. But I think that having a symbol on the field could supplement the need to belong to something else, a teenager's desire, unless it's part of an official ceremony or a cultural engagement that's sanctioned. I would discourage the use of headdresses at football games.
Thank you.
Just to avoid misunderstandings, right? Thank you.
Thank you. And just a quick housekeeping item before we move forward. So this is being recorded for the archives. It would be very helpful if when you're not speaking, if you could try to mute your microphones so that our recording can reflect the active speaker for later reference. That would be extremely helpful. And then also just another quick note that as a work session of the board, this is just a Q&A session for the board and not for the public. That will, however, I think as you're hearing here this evening, happen at a later time. Everybody will have their chance to provide input to the process. But this evening is it's open to the public for many reasons, legal and just wanting to be transparent about our process. So we appreciate your patience and greatly appreciate your attendance and willingness to be a part of this process. So with that, I'll push it back to board members that may have questions.
Yes, may I ask a question?
Please do.
My name is Donna Smith, and I'm a member of the Bellefonte School Board. So I have done my own research, just trying to wrap my head around the various opinions. And I did read a lot from the National Congress of American Indians, which, as you know, is the oldest and the largest of all the American Indian organizations. And they strongly oppose the use of natives for sports mascots, unless the mascot refers to a particular native nation. And unfortunately, ours does not. We're the Red Raiders. And they say that presenting that mascot is a misleading image of Indian people, and it feeds historical myths that have been used to whitewash a history of oppression. And in 2013, they adopted a resolution to eliminate racist stereotypes in sports. And so my question is, which side is right? That side or your side? And do you agree that unless it's a particular Native nation reference, it is harmful? And what is your opinion on that?
Chief, would you like to take this?
Yes, I have a comment. I happen to be a member of the Native American Congress, okay? And there are some things that I agree with and some things I disagree with. And every individual, whether you are First American, Indigenous American, or whatever, has a right to do that, okay? Now, what is the difference between having an icon and just instead of having an icon, have that icon just represent a particular nation? What's the difference in that? There is no difference. As an example, we have a tribal shield, which is patented with the Library of Congress, okay, that says Chero and Haka, Nottoway Indian Tribe, South African County, Virginia, River, which we say on Nos Chioki Choki in our tribal language, the Blackwater River, and in that fork, it shows where it forms the Shawan River, where we have 3 villages identified by Edward Bland in 1640 in his Southampton County. So, as an example, let's my community, okay? They are known as the Southampton County Indians. I'm just so glad that all of the scuttlebutt associated with terms being racist have not hit my school yet here in Southampton County. But they call themselves the Southampton County Indians, okay? Always have. Now, they have a mascot. They have a mascot that wears a war bunny. Okay. Matter of fact, I gifted the mascot the war bunny. I gifted him that war bunny myself because he's approximately 50% native, and he's been the mascot for the Southampton County Indians since the school started. He's about almost 70 years old now. He started doing it when he was 20 years old. So, and I get back again to that term Blackfeet. Is that a prejudice term? Is that derogatory? Because there's a tribe that's called the Blackfeet Indian Nation, because the colonials gave them that name because they painted their legs from their knees down black whenever they went to war, just like we painted our bodies red when we went to war. Is that a derogatory, a prejudice name? No, it's not. It was It was a name of honor that was given to the tribe, the Blackfeet Nation, okay? And you need to read some information on the Sac tribe, okay, in your area. Matter of fact, the chief of the Sac tribe was at the end of the war was put in irons and chains and taken to Fort Monroe, which is no longer in being now, and locked up, okay? So you need to read that because it attributes to the Red Raiders. That's what it does, okay? There's a lot of history out there that attributes to Red Raiders. Red is a color of protection from the Creator. That's why Native people painted their bodies red when they went to war, okay? Either their face or their upper torso red, because that was a religious means by which the Creator was protecting them in battle. So that's a part of our culture, that's a part of our traditions, and a part of our history.
Hey, Donna, this is Andre. I'd like to
go to National Congress of American Indians.
Yeah. With the NCAI, they're a 501c3, just like NAGA is.
Exactly.
Their foundational roots come from an organization known as the Society of the Red Men, which is a derivative of the Sons of Liberty, which is a derivative of those who follow the Great Law of Peace. That's their DNA. They are an old organization, and it was the ex-president of the NCAI who bequeathed to the NFL and to the American public the image of the Blackfoot chief, Two Guns Whitecap, in the early 70s. Same thing happened with the Sioux in 1969. The tribe bequeathed the image of the Fighting Sioux to the state of North Dakota using a sacred pipe ceremony in 1969 that was supposed to be forever. More recently, the tribe itself took a vote, and a supermajority voted to keep their image with the University of North Dakota, a supermajority. That same supermajority was measured by Sports Illustrated some years later. And as I referenced in 2019, we had a very, very good pride vote on natives with the identity of Redskins. But let me also mention that the NCAI themselves uses a Red Raider, if you will, for their own mascot. Again, it's an icon, it's a symbol. But to use the vernacular, they reference a Plains Native style headdress and the color red as their symbol. So when you have a difference of opinion, you'll note that the NCAI is a very vociferous political organization. And we know this for a fact based on national surveys and polls that the folks of the NCAI, the mouthpieces, do not represent the rank and file members of the tribe, nor those living off the reservation, not even close. A lot of their opinions have a political edge to them. I can explain in detail and in depth and probably keep you busy for an hour, but I'll leave that on the table for later.
This is Rob Musser from
Thank
the
you.
Bellefonte School Board. Can you hear me? So
I can hear you.
So first of all, there is no Red Raider tribe in Pennsylvania, just out there. I have looked at the tribes in Virginia, and congratulations, Chief Brown, for becoming, for getting the tribe included. But in viewing all the crests, I don't see anything on any of the crests for the 11 tribes that indicate any kind of warlike stance, or there's lots of imagery there, but nothing that is like the icons that appear in any of the high schools that portray themselves as Native Americans. I have a question also, well, actually a request for Andre to supply us with the numbers that you quoted from some kind of a source, please. And I want to also have some kind of discourse on your take on the chant that's provided at the beginning of the school day at Bellefonte, because we know that some of the problems that have arisen is because the chants don't replicate anything like a Native American chant of any kind. you respond to that, please?
Rob, hi, this is Andre. If you want to be specific with what data you're looking for, just have yourself or Jeff shoot me an email. With regards to the chant, Nagas, for instance, is working with members of the executive staff of the Atlanta Braves to get the Atlanta Braves to actually teach their fans a Cherokee chant that actually means something. If you go to the Cherokee ancestral capital north of Atlanta, if you've ever been there, one of the big pushes that the Cherokee who maintain that site are doing is that they have language learning machines. Very specifically, they would like to teach their visitors the fact that A, they had a written language, and B, they had a newspaper, and C, that the language is being saved. So that said, just off the top of my head, I would suggest if the school wishes to maintain some semblance of authenticity, that you might try something Iroquoian that's as taught and provided by a chief who might have ties to education in a certain state, so that your students would actually learn something authentic, and maybe change it up every month to learn something new. That's just off the top of my head, but I'm sure it can be remedied to success. Chief, you have anything? Can anybody hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Chief Red Hawk, are you still on?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Hi.
Okay, good. Hold on a second. Hold 1 second, please. Hello? Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, Chief.
Okay, good. Okay. In reference to tribal shields, some of the shields of the tribes in North Carolina, you'll see a tomahawk on it, okay? Now, on our particular shield, we have the peace pipe. And what does that peace pipe represent? It represents the 3 treaties of peace after war that we signed. The Treaty of 1646, the Treaty of 1677, which we call the Woodland Plantation Treaty, which took place in Williamsburg. A lot of people refer to that treaty as Tupam Wampum. In our Iroquois language, we say Decaneo Chikoa. And so that peace pipe represents the treaty. Someone left their phone in my car. Okay, I got to find out what's going on. Hello? Yeah, somebody left their phone in my car. Who's this? Hey, okay, I'm going to turn around and bring it back, okay? I think my kid must have picked it up. Okay, I'm headed back with it.
Just to let everyone know, I connected Rodney with Andre versus email so that he can directly request the information that he wanted from Andre.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is Chief Brown. I apologize. My daughter was at the beautician getting her hair braided because it's gotten so long. And evidently when she walked out, she picked up her beautician cell phone. So that was her calling me on her cell phone. So I'm going to turn around and head back to Petersburg and return the cell phone. But either way, getting back to the symbols, if I may, please. We have the peace pipe on our tribal shield, which is patented with the Library of Congress. And again, it represents 3 treaties of peace that took place after the war. 1646, 1677, which took place after Bacon's Rebellion. And you can read Bacon's Rebellion, okay, where he was involved in the cutting off the Susquehanna, who came out of Pennsylvania to Prince George County and were attacked by the colonials. And they retaliated, and they went to Occoneechee Island, where the Occoneechee and Saponi were. And supposedly, all the Susquehanna Indians there were kidnapped and actually killed, which is not really true, because history says that there was another tribe that went over to North Carolina on the Susquehanna, because some of them escaped. But anyway, so some of the shields do reflect warlike imagery, okay? And I just want you to know that, and I just want to caveat that. There are some shields that reflect warlike imagery. We did it in a sultry way by putting the peace pipe on our shield. Thank you.
Hey, Chief, can you give any comments about their desire to explore versus singing a war chant at the school? Could there be anything else that could substitute?
Yes.
That'll give some lifelong learning?
Yes, thank you. If you ever been to a Native American powwow, okay, the drum songs are international, intertribal, okay? What you need to do is to get like maybe Yatana, a Southern Eagle, CD, and just learn one of the songs. You can learn a grand entry song, okay? As an example, the grand entry of the football team coming in or whatever, they can sing it. Like, hey ho. I mean, it's intertribal. So get a good drum CD and get your school body to learn it. It's easy to pick up the words on it, okay, and do the chant. And that's intertribal. It goes across the board for all Native nations in the United States. Did everybody hear me on that, or was I muted out?
We did hear you just fine. Thank you very much.
So one of the questions, this is Julie Fitzgerald again. One of the questions that I have is what I'm hearing a lot of is to really retain this symbol is that we should really make a lot of changes if we're going to retain it. The ways that we represent it, the imagery that perhaps that we use, perhaps how we use the chant and those kinds of things that as we are doing it now is not, as acceptable or as respectful as we could be. So change would be needed in the future to retain the symbol.
This is Andre. Yes, indeed, and that was kind of part of the state of Pennsylvania's remedy going forward. Is that sensitivity should be looked at, more inclusionary contextual history, a full review of history. Nothing should be hidden. That the pride and honor of Native Americanism in America is its foundational principles: law, culture, design, art, language. That assimilation happened both ways. And that there is a modern way forward for any Native American student that's not, stuck in the past, so to speak. That that assimilation into the Native American culture has traditionally been seen as a very good thing, with the exception of certain times and pockets. For instance, in the state legislature of Massachusetts, many of the early leaders felt threatened by the Native American traditions culture and banned, made laws against any Christian to live with, cohort with, take lessons from, or spend time with Native Americans. That's kind of the worst case scenario, and it's antithetical to what America actually is today, what it should be, e pluribus unum, under our one creator. But yes, to answer your question, yes, and that's what Naga, on behalf of Naga, I talked to them today, the leaders. They're all about helping you get to the place where it's a win-win, to be culturally sensitive, to bring in Native artists. We have leaders like Chief Red Hawk who could provide guidance, training, education elements to mitigate some of the questionable practices that some may have. And that can be done rather quickly in a good spirit of good faith. And I believe you have a path forward, which would be very solid. Once again, citing a win-win, and in tandem with the way the state hearing officer made the other school go forward.
But not business as usual.
Well, now that you know better, that's right. The more we all know, the better off we will all be. So yes.
Very good. We're nearing the end of the time we had scheduled. Are there any other questions from the board this evening? Okay. Well, with that, then I will say a very big thank you to Dr. Lopez, Chief Brown, and Mr. Billeaudeaux for your time this evening, for your honesty in the situation or on the topic. And I appreciate the board members in asking probably some tough questions, but questions that need to be asked and need to be addressed. Tonight was a beginning nowhere near the end or even the middle. So tonight is absolutely a beginning. I think there's a lot of learning and education that needs to happen at the board level and within our community to further understand and appreciate and learn how to move forward. So again, this is just the first steps in our journey. And to those that have joined us from the public, thank you for your time this evening. We look forward to a time when you will all have a chance to speak as well. So with that, thank you again to all and have a wonderful evening and hopefully a very nice week to come. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.